Hi, and welcome to the next webinar. We'll be talking about neurodiversity in adult education and how we can empower our learners with autism and ADHD. I'm Dr. Jenny Root. I'm very excited to be joining you all again. So I'm sure some of you are already putting this into the chat, but let's get to know each other and see who's here today. So if you can put your name, where you are, and what your role is, and then if you're an FSU alum, let me know. So the goals for this webinar are that you'll be able to explain the concept of neurodiversity, which if you've been attending the webinars, I've been threading in some components of this. You'll be able to identify common strengths and needs of neurodiverse adult students and then build self-determination skills through UDL. All right, so as a review, what is neurodiversity? If you have attended before, I want you to take a minute to pause and think to see if you can remember what that means. So when we say anything related to neuro, we're talking about the nerves, the nervous system, brain, and then diverse just means there's a variety. And so the neurodiversity perspective is that brain differences are normal. So we don't necessarily see them as deficits. We don't even all the time see it as disabling or a disability because it depends on the degree to which it impacts lives. So the differences that we may observe in people are not weaknesses, and therefore we don't need to necessarily fix them or cure them. They're variations of the human brain. However, back to that socioecological view of disability, we have maybe an individual who we know has autism and has difficulties with social communication. And then we have the environment where maybe there aren't explicit explanations or rules when it comes to social norms. So in this case, that neurodiversity might be disabling. It might be the environment that's disabling. And there needs to be something that happens that brings those two things together. Sometimes it may just be that an individual needs some skills built up. And sometimes it might just be the environment needs to change. And we can use that UDL framework to help us because we want to acknowledge individual strengths. We want to use strengths-based approaches. And so we don't want to see neurodiversity or the way that might present in a person as a deficit, but rather that comes with strengths. It comes with needs, just like we all have strengths and needs. But we always want to remember that neurodiversity does not replace disability. We can put neurodiversity on a spectrum. I would argue especially, well, obviously autism is a spectrum because that's the name of it, autism spectrum disorder, but ADHD is also a spectrum. And so we don't want to just put everyone under this umbrella because that stops acknowledging the disabling impact of disabilities. So it's okay to use the words diagnosis and disability, not bad words. They're good because when we know that someone has a disability, when they themselves know that they have a disability, they are able to advocate for themselves, have protections under the law. We can then maybe know some instructional strategies or some learning profiles that might be helpful. The common disabilities of students who may identify as neurodiverse would be speech and language impairment, specific learning disability, intellectual disability, autism, ADHD. Most often what we hear, and especially from the adult self-advocates, it's really those with autism and ADHD. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those now. So let's review first, what does it mean to have autism spectrum disorder? What do we know about that? Well, we know that there are structural, chemical, and functional aspects of the neurological system that are different for people who have autism and those who don't. And the result of those differences is that they interact with and experience the world differently. So a key thing to understand is that it's developmental. So there are changes over time. And it's related to their nerves, their brain, the way that they're wired, not a choice to be difficult or a choice to have strong preferences and be inflexible. Certainly, we can build up skills and to help people make choices that might be more socially appropriate or help them meet their goals. But it's important to understand that this is a medical biological disorder. So there are, for example, different patterns of thickness in the cortex. There's excessive cerebrospinal fluid. We know that the amygdala is more affected in autistic girls, and the specifically a larger amygdala, and that causes more emotional difficulties, like difficulties with emotional regulation. We know that there's an enlarged hippocampus, decreased brain tissue in the cerebellum, and a shortened brainstem. And we've gotten a lot of this research from autopsies of people with autism, and it's becoming more and more clear the brain-based differences in individuals who have that. But I think it's important that we talk about the history of diagnosing ASD. There's a lot of myths and like folklore and things that are assumed about, for example, when I was in, not me, I'm younger, but some people might say, well, when I was in school, there wasn't, I didn't see people with autism, or we didn't know that, or I didn't have friends with autism. And I would say there's a twofold issue there. One is we have the way that we define autism and diagnose it has changed over time, just like most of our disabilities, especially psychiatric conditions. And then two, well, you may not have seen those people, not because they didn't exist, but because they weren't in the spaces that you were in. They were in separate schools or in separate classes or in institutions, versus now where we want everyone to have a sense of belonging and inclusion within our school community, faith communities, and workplace. So the DSM-5 is what we use to diagnose psychiatric disorders. It's a diagnostic and statistical manual, and it updates over time as research evolves, right? So the very first and second DSMs didn't even have autism listed as a disorder. Autistic behavior was mentioned in childhood schizophrenia, right? And so thinking about what it was like at that time, individuals with autism who it presented really severely in childhood, who had maybe weren't able to develop vocal communication, had extreme repetitive behaviors and restricted interests, they were most likely to be sent into an institution and then live there for the rest of their lives. In 1980, when we had the DSM-3 come out, finally there was some movement and some increase in descriptions of autism. So at that point, there were things called a pervasive developmental disorder. And if it was diagnosed before 30 months, or if it was an onset, evidence of onset before 30 months, we called it infantile autism. If the onset was after 30 months, then it was childhood onset pervasive developmental disorder, which came from this belief at the time, or what was the knowledge at the time, is that if it was autism, we'd know before 30 months. And then there was atypical autism, which was a focus only on social skills and language. Well, then that led to, in the DSM-4 in 1994, we still have pervasive developmental disorders, right? And under that umbrella was autistic disorder if the onset was before 36 months. PDD-NOS, so pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, which just meant it was after 36 months. And Asperger's disorder, that is where that atypical autism sort of migrated into. Now, Hans Asperger was a problematic individual. So while he may have made some contributions to the scientific understanding of autism, or Asperger's syndrome, as it became called, we no longer categorize or classify autism in that way. And further, Hans Hans Asperger was a Nazi and anti-Semite, and just a generally problematic individual. And so the field at large no longer recognizes that disorder and that name. But that's not to say that someone who may have had Asperger's now doesn't, right? The characteristics of the individuals hasn't changed. What has changed is the way that we diagnose and sort of the buckets we put people in. So now versus having an umbrella of pervasive developmental disorders, 2013, we had the DSM-5 come out and we had this umbrella of autism spectrum disorders. Now, what the popular press and teachers and stuff used to say is, oh, they got rid of Asperger's. That's not exactly what happened, right? Because if we look at this change over time, the labels we use change. So autism in 2013 was then defined as deficits in social communication, social interaction, restrictive or repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. So we have these two criteria. And what they did then was have levels to that criteria of level 1, 2, and 3 to indicate the severity or the degree to which it impacts life functioning. They also identified then a social pragmatic disorder, and that's individuals who meet all the requirements when it comes to social communication and language, but not in the behavioral aspects. All right, so here's another way to sort of visualize the differences. So figure A shows the DSM-4, where we looked at these 3 separate areas: speech communication, language, social impairment, and restricted and repetitive behaviors. Then in the DSM-5, we see this now as we have individuals who might have difficulty with social communication. That would be that social pragmatic disorder. We might have individuals with restricted and repetitive interests. But if they have both, then we consider that to be an autism spectrum disorder. So it means that we have deficits in communication and social interactions. Some example of that is social emotional reciprocity. So understanding and being able to match and have a give and take. The nonverbal communicative behavior. So that's where that eye contact stereotype comes from. And then difficulty developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. Notice that none of that has anything to do with not being interested in a social relationship, because that's a human drive that is, there's variability too, right? Some of us are more extroverted than others. Some, are perfectly happy with having like 2 or 3 close friends. Others want like a very large group of friends, right? So it's not about their interest, it's their capacity to develop, maintain, and then understand those complex relationships. Then the second part is restricted and repetitive behavior. So these might look like stereotypy. So sometimes we call that stimming, where it's repetitive motor movements, use of objects, or speech. We all stim to some degree. It's a part of self-regulation, right? So how many of you right now are, tapping a pen or clicking a pen or rotating your hair or playing with your nails or shaking your leg, right? Those are things that we almost unconsciously do, and it's a self-regulatory strategy. For individuals with autism, this might be to a more extreme degree, or it may look different. There's also an insistence on sameness, wanting to have consistent routines and patterns, sort of the order in which an activity is done, may have highly restricted or fixated interests that are of abnormal intensity. So for example, an extreme interest in flags of the world, or vacuum cleaners, public transportation. So those are just some of the examples. But then a lot of us have interests, right? Things that we are, if someone comes and asks me about Real Housewives of New York City, I have lots of opinions and I would love to talk about it. Somebody comes and talks to me about Taylor Swift. That is one of my interests. And I like to drop in lyrics as references in some of the talks I give to see if anybody noticed. So we all have these. right? It just might be to a abnormal or more significant intensity or focus. And then the last component of this is hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input. So we talked about this in the January webinar, but it's that being very aware of sensory input. So being hyper aware, or they might be hypo aware. So might need more input than someone else in order for their needs to be met. So again, as a review, the DSM-4 looked at autism, PDD, NOS, and Asperger's, and then now we have levels. So level 1 means they require support, level 2 requires substantial support, and level 3 requires very substantial support. And that's often going to be across all domains of life, things like daily living skills, personal hygiene, communication, safety issues. Okay, but there are a lot of disabilities that may have like some flavors of this, right? So we don't want to go out saying, oh, well, you have difficulty understanding social cues and social relationships, so you must have autism, right? There are other things that influence this spectrum. One of those is intellectual ability. So if you notice, nothing in the, I'll go back to the criteria for having autism, nothing in there has anything to do with intellect, right? With your intelligence or your adaptive behavior, right? But we know that autism is prevalent across, the human spectrum, which means that some individuals with autism may have above average intelligence, some may have, severe intellectual disability, and everywhere in between. We know that language skills vary as well. So they could have, very fluent language, no difficulty with being able to express themselves, but all the way to individuals who are minimally verbal and don't develop vocal speech, or it's to a limited degree and they're not able to rely on that to meet their needs. Similarly, then we have adaptive functioning. So that can influence an individual's success in school and in living independently in a job setting. And so we would say that probably most adults who don't identify as having a disability are independent in their adaptive behavior. You're able to cook safely in your home, identify, when to throw food out, how long can you leave food on the counter, how to navigate public transportation, right? But then there are other common aspects of individuals with autism. So it's very common to have GI disturbances. Many find that going on a gluten-free diet is helpful. Sleep disturbances, it's very common for individuals with autism to just not need as much sleep as other people, or to have a lot of difficulty going to sleep or staying asleep. Epilepsy is common, but many people who have epilepsy don't have autism. And then there are things like irritability, ADHD, anxiety, depression, OCD, these other psychiatric disorders that can be comorbid or happen at the same time, or not. You can have, I call it just vanilla anxiety, not to downplay it, without having these other things. So what I want the takeaway message to be is, this is why, if you've ever heard the phrase, you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, this is why, because it's so different across these different areas of what makes us people, right? There's wide variability in our language abilities, in our social communication and intellect, in mood and adaptive functioning. And so it's not a spectrum like sometimes we think about it, where you're either like have a little bit of autism or like have a lot of bit of autism, but rather it influences all these different areas of life. So our current prevalence estimates are that 1 in 54 children are diagnosed according to the CDC, and it's more commonly identified in boys. Not saying that it is more actually prevalent, but it's more commonly identified. And boys are more likely to be identified, especially now, earlier than girls. I'll talk about why in a second. We don't know the specific cause. Genetics and environment probably have something to do with it. And there are some risk factors: familial history, your sex, having other disorders. But we know that autism is not caused by bad parenting, allergies, gluten. Like if you just go on a ketogenic diet, then you won't have autism anymore. No. Now, maybe that is going to improve your health, your mood. Like when we don't feel good, we're pretty irritable. That's typical. The intelligence of your parents and vaccines. We know that all of those things don't impact autism. But when we look at these prevalence estimates by sex, we see that for every one girl, 4.1 boys were identified with ASD. So this is what we currently know. So when you see that like overall prevalence estimate, the boys are really dragging that up compared to the females. So why? I think that, all of these are important, but where I'm going to start is this concept of masking. So females with autism and ADHD are less likely to present with a social communication deficit, particularly if there is not always also a intellectual or cognitive impairment. In other words, girls are better able to observe the people around them, to explicitly pick up on social cues or kind of like read the room and then copy it. So if you're able to do that, if you are don't have these big externalizing behaviors, you're not causing a disruption in school to the class. If you have the ability to talk, so your communication is not a barrier, then girls may just go unidentified. And being able to mask or pretend to engage socially does not mean they actually have genuine responses to those things. We also know that when it comes to those repetitive and restrictive behaviors, girls may have special interests that just blend in culturally, right? So a lot of little girls are interested in horses. It might just be to a greater degree, or anime, or a particular celebrity. And so if girls have a sort of age-appropriate, culturally common interest, it may not be seen as like that diagnostic criteria. So what we currently estimate is that 80% of autistic girls remain undiagnosed. So many are just struggling. They often have internalizing psychiatric disorders, things like anxiety, depression, eating disorder, and then self-harm that is non-suicidal. So self-harm that the point is to get sensory input and self-regulation, and have an outlet or a release for feelings that they have difficulty otherwise expressing. Because these girls, they're able to see what's going on, mask, and they are hyper aware that there is a difference between them and other people. So what these estimates say is perhaps instead of this 1-to-4 ratio, there might be a 4-to-3 ratio. So overall, our women with autism are at increased risk for victimization, increased risk of co-occurring health conditions, risk of depression, anxiety, and developing PTSD. It's also important to know that there are disparities in diagnosis based on race. So on average, Latino children are diagnosed 2.5 years later than white non-Latino children. So that's not saying that, if you had two individuals who present really similarly, a white child may get diagnosed and intervention at 18 months to 2 years. And then the Latino child, it might not be until they're 4.5. And so the difference in outcomes that then results are are the years of early intervention and services. It's not quite a start for Black children, but it's still 1.4 years later is the average. And they're more likely to be, Black children are more likely to be misdiagnosed. So to be diagnosed with something else, such as a conduct disorder or an intellectual disability or ADHD, than actually being diagnosed with what it is. So I referenced this before, and I've included it in previous presentations, but what people often think of the spectrum, right? You're a little bit autistic or you're a lot of it, but it actually looks like this wheel, right? So we have all these different aspects that might impact an individual. So this is what it ends up looking like, right? When we think about what exactly are the specific ways that those, brief criteria, what do those look like in the classroom? Looking at these 7 areas can help give more information. So it's things like, pragmatic language, being able to take turns, make small talk. And then also relates to social awareness. So kind of being able to understand social taboos, why it might be rude to ask somebody their age. Being able to control the like blurting out or understanding that there's maybe a discussion happening in class, but I only get to interject one time. A monotropic mindset is when they have that intense ability to focus, but what that might end up looking like is difficulty switching tasks because you want to finish this thing. It's that rigidity of wanting to finish one thing before going on to another. Information processing, which is probably the one that is the quickest to address and most within the purview of a teacher. Sensory processing, we've talked about that, hyper or hyposensitivity, the repetitive behaviors and stimming. We do it, it's, that's not something I think to call attention to. It's when it becomes problematic for that individual, is if it becomes harmful to them. So sometimes we have what we call self-injurious behavior. So someone might pick their skin, but then pick their skin to the point where they're bleeding continually and get scars and get infections, things like that. And the neuromotor difficulty differences is the ability to control movement. So might be seen as like clumsiness, difficulty with handwriting are related to these differences that are all drawn back to the brain. Okay, so very commonly comorbid with autism is ADHD. We don't know what causes it. We do know that it's highly familial, but then there can be some non-genetic risk factors, premature birth, alcohol and drug consumption, because it impacts the chemicals in your brain as well as your neurosynapses, right? So how information is processed, your reward center in your brain, the amount of dopamine you get, the amount of dopamine you have naturally versus what you need to seek out. And then there are some psychosocial factors that might encourage the development of it, right? Like not having a structured or daily routine, high media consumption. High media consumption is not going to make somebody have ADHD, but what it is probably going to do is exacerbate symptoms because things like TikTok, I love it. That is like immediate dopamine hits, right? And regular life is boring in comparison. And when you have this combined with impulsivity, it's really hard to focus on your work and not just watch TikToks. Lack of exercise can also contribute, and conversely, consistent exercise, especially cardio, getting your heart rate up, can be effective in helping to manage ADHD. Currently, what we think is there's more of a neurological rationale or reason than the social or environmental. So in individuals with ADHD, they have this imbalance of neurotransmitters in the brain, right? So I referenced dopamine before, but we also have noradrenaline. Those are important in order to be able to transmit information between nerve cells. When you don't have enough dopamine, then it's in the synaptic cleft. then the transmission between nerve cells is impaired. So what does that mean? It means that stimuli are poorly filtered in, right? So our brain then can be overstimulated constantly and not able to attend to specific things. So it's hard then to differentiate between what's important and unimportant, right? Because our brains are designed to only take in and retain the important things. Whereas right now I can hear the fluorescent light buzzing, and I've been consistently aware of it this entire time. So whereas there's a stereotype of ADHD being inattention, I think it's more of like too much attention. It's inhibition is the uh, is a central part of it. So there are two in the current DSM. This is the way that we look at ADHD. So there can be an inattentive subtype or hyperactive subtype. But what's important to know is that the hyperactive might not necessarily be moving, right? It might not be getting up and going and sharpening your pencil in the middle of somebody talking, or dropping something on the floor and then getting down there and finding it. And it doesn't have to be that. You can be restless and fidgety internally in your brain. And especially for females who, when we're able to read the room, when we understand sort of the contingencies of how we get social praise and what's expected of us, then we learn ways to manifest that internally. So it might be this bouncing from one activity to the next, whether it's actually physically going to different things. But I struggle with this when I'm working. I'm working on this, but then I see an email come in and I start to respond to it, but then I go back to this, and it's this difficulty because you actually can't do more than one thing at once. But then the inattentive component is trouble concentrating. Quickly, I call them chasing the squirrels, right? Of what I'm thinking about. That can result in problems with planning, organizing, and finishing tasks on time, and then learning new things, especially things that take persistence. So individuals can also have combined. So you can be diagnosed as having inattentive, hyperactive, or combined, right? So again, this inattentive might look like being highly distracted, overlooking details, trouble regulating your focus. That can lead to anxiety and depression because it, especially when it starts to impact your job, paying bills, your social relationships, sort of your self-efficacy and how you view yourself. That is what can impact and lead to or contribute to anxiety and depression. Hyperactive, then we talk about impulsivity, the fidgetness, and this you're more likely to have co-occurring externalizing behaviors like ODD. It's more commonly diagnosed as with males, but then we can have both as well. So what does ADHD look like across the lifespan? What might it look like in your class? Well, for preschoolers, it might look like behavioral disturbances or differences, so that we haven't learned social skills yet. All the kids are still learning it. And so even for the girls who may not have learned like how to mask or pay attention and imitate people. And so if anyone is diagnosed with ADHD in preschool, it's most likely that they are going to have that hyperactive to an extreme degree. Once we get into school age, it looks like continued behavioral disturbances. It also contributes to academic difficulties. Again, ADHD as well as autism have nothing to do with intelligence. That wasn't in the criteria at all. But the behaviors that are required for learning are difficult. Paying attention, taking notes, reading comprehension, often that can lead to poor social interactions and peer acceptance, particularly depending on the degree of the behavioral disturbances. either because they have difficulty with interpersonal relationships, or often we know that when the students in the class know when there's a student who frequently gets in trouble or is bad. Um, and so sometimes students can see that one student is being treated differently by the teacher and they imitate that. As you get into adolescent years, it just continue to have academic difficulties. It's going to result in lower self-esteem. You're at much higher risk of alcohol and substance abuse or social interactions as you begin to take on more responsibility and have more things that you're responsible for carrying out throughout the day. That can become overwhelming. The support we provide in school settings especially fades over time, right? As individuals get older. And that can become difficult. Being able to get and keep a job is also going to be impacted. And then as we get into adulthood, so the adult learners that you have are very likely to have difficulty with daily tasks, lower self-esteem. They've had this negative learning experience. Or, in my case, I didn't have a negative learning experience. I was very successful. I was very good at school. But I had internalized some things that were just not true or harmful. So I struggle with forms and paperwork and keeping up with all of that. And so I thought I'm just lazy. I'm just disorganized, right? Not realizing, no, I struggle with executive functioning. And so then they're more likely to have, relationship problems, mood instability, unemployment, and substance abuse. As I said, ADHD and autism occur very frequently together, meaning individuals with autism are likely to also meet the criteria for ADHD. But like I remember going through my master's degree and my undergraduate degree and learned like you can't have autism and ADHD. And then DSM-5, 2013, like, oh, what do you know? So science evolves. So I'm often asked then if there's so much, so much overlap, then what are the differences between them? So ADHD, a diagnosis is generally not going to happen before preschool, kindergarten, if at all in the school age, versus signs of autism are often noticeable before 2 years old, and definitely by kindergarten. Now, whether or not someone's identified is another matter, but the signs are there. Autism is a lifelong. It's considered to impact your life in sort of all areas to some degree, versus ADHD. It depends on your coping skills and strategies that you develop. This research said that up to a third of children with ADHD don't really have impairing symptoms in adulthood. So if you think about, they both have difficulty focusing. And you have two students. You have a student with autism and a student with ADHD. A student with ADHD is going to be easily distracted. They're going to have difficulty sustaining attention on one task until it's completed. So they may be hyper-focused if something is interesting to them and important to them. But even then, it's being able to, I call it like my laser beam, being able to point my laser beam where it's supposed to be, when it's supposed to be there. Autism then are more likely to be over-focused and having difficulty transitioning to the next task because they want it to be completed, and therefore might be inflexible in routines and preferences. So given all of this information about neurodiverse learners and what they may experience and what's going on biologically with them, we can then take a look at some strengths-based approaches, because these are not things to be cured or to go away, but rather how can we help leverage their characteristics as strengths as we help support adult learners to be successful. So some signs of strengths-based teaching are things like recognizing how individuals are interpreting the words, ideas, their environment, and you. So it's all about understanding the perspective of the individual, doing some perspective taking, being willing to learn about them, asking questions about how they, what their preferences are and why, versus this maybe more traditional and medical view of, well, they just need to learn to adjust to me and to the expectations of the school. So when we think about the altered cognition that's common about with individuals with autism and ADHD, what that can look like is over selectivity. So it's difficult to attend to a lot of things at once and sort of shift between auditory and visual stimuli. So a strategy then is to make sure that we are focusing on what exactly we want the student to do and just having them do that. So for example, not having them take notes while they're listening. Two things at once is going to be very difficult. So they're not going to do one of them. Breaking large tasks into smaller chunks. So if it's really difficult and overwhelming to take on a big task, and we'll talk about strategic learners in a moment, then we can break that down into smaller amounts so that it can seem manageable. Another thing to do is to give a preview. Everybody wants to know when they're going to be done. And so if you can explain, like, these are the things we're going to be doing today, or you need to complete this, and this before you move on to the next milestone in our class. And then graphic organizers, which I'll also give more details on, because the graphic organizers are going to help make sometimes abstract things concrete, where I can see them visually. And it also explicitly draws out relationships between things versus assuming that an individual is able to just infer a relationship. Another phenomena related to altered social cognition is theory of mind. So theory of mind is the ability to understand that we have different mental states. So awareness of your own mental state, but then an awareness that someone else's mental state is likely to be different from mine. So I may have my beliefs and my desires, but someone else is going to have a different intention. And this directly impacts their confidence and their motivation, because it can make the world feel like a guessing game, like they never know what to expect or how somebody might react. I've heard from autistic teenagers that, like, other people don't follow the rules. Like, how come they learn the rules, and as soon as they learn it, then something changes. It can also impact gestures, eye contact, and nonverbal communication, because a lot of the nonverbal communication that we provide is to acknowledge the speaker, right? So if you have students sitting in your class as you're presenting information, they might be nodding their head, they might be smiling, right? The purpose of doing that is to signal to you that they're with you, they understand, they have a high degree of engagement. So that is me recognizing that you might want that. When we started, when everything went to Zoom and there were the black boxes I had to teach from, it was really hard because I didn't get that nonverbal feedback. And so I would ask, like, please, if you're there, turn your camera on, so I can get this. And so they provided that nonverbal feedback to me, realizing that it's the listener, the speaker, who needs it. It also impacts reading comprehension, in that anytime that we're having to make inferences, either explicit inferences, maybe about author's purpose, right? Or why a character did a certain thing, or how events in history are linked together. It might be difficult for them to make those links if they are not explicit. So what this might look like in the classroom is difficulty with the concept of time and urgency, realizing that maybe reading some body cues of, you want me to wrap it up. Difficulty with cause and effect, emotional regulation, relationships, more abstract concepts, and reduced sort of funds of information. The individuals need to be able to learn the rules or the relationships, the things that we're teaching before they can learn exceptions, versus neurotypical individuals might just be able to pick up on those things. For example, when do I call somebody by their first name, and when do I use their title? So the impact of the altered social cognition might look like this. Social skills, what those are in essence, are the ability to accommodate or adapt to ongoing situations and social interactions. And that's 100% culturally and contextually situated, right? Um, can I adapt what I'm doing based on whether I'm in a very nice restaurant or a business casual restaurant, whether I am at home with my family or I'm on the job site. In order to be able to adapt, to recognize what the situation is and adapt to it, that requires continual self-monitoring and adjustment. So it's being able to not only identify like what should be happening, but comparing that to their own responding and adjusting it. The result, what peers and employers and teachers and family members may see, is delayed, inappropriate, or misunderstood responses because of that difficulty in monitoring and adjusting behaviors. You can't adjust a behavior you're not aware of, and you can't change your behavior if you don't know what to change it to. So things that we can do to support are using schedules and calendars consistently, not just telling them, hey, you should go get a planner or, use your Outlook calendar for everything, but creating systems and supporting systems for them to learn how to do that in a way that works for them. As I said before, breaking the large tasks into smaller chunks, giving previews, and then the graphic organizers that can make things really concrete. So as we think about the needs of our neurodiverse students, our goals for them in the classroom are not going to be drastically different from our neurotypical students, right? We just recognize that these individuals may have a barrier to aspects of learning that needs to be accommodated or addressed. But the variability is just an expected part of having a classroom of more than one person. So the UDL framework has 9 guidelines that can be implemented flexibly to promote multiple means of representation, engagement, and action expression, as we talked about in the January webinar. So we want to think about engagement, or the why of learning. So what are different ways that we can support all of the students in the classroom, including the neurodiverse students, with interest, effort, persistence, and self-regulation? So we think about everything I just talked about in characteristics of neurodiverse students. These, how do they maintain interest and persistence in something they're not interested in, right? What about self-regulating and building self-monitoring? The second component is representation. So the what of learning. How are we making sure that they are able to, that they're getting the accurate information, especially if we're doing things like talking at the same time as we expect them to be taking notes, or if we are using words and language that's ambiguous or very unclear, and then the student may just not even understand the task direction, or totally misunderstand it. And finally, the action and expression of, how are they going to express and show what they know? And that draws on communication, which every individual with autism is going to have a language and communication difficulty. Now, your students who are adults may have already either been explicitly taught or developed over time some coping strategies for that, or not. And then executive functioning, being able to make a plan, identify a goal, work towards it, manage multiple things at one time, is also a characteristic difficulty of neurodiverse students. So if we remember, just like ADHD and autism are neurological disorders and impact the brain, UDL is based off of what we know about how our brains learn. and what is required. And they distill it down to these three areas. So one is when we have those recognition networks, the what of learning. So sensory information is received in the back of the brain. That includes the occipital and temporal lobes. So if we take in sensory information, and that's a key consideration of UDL, we need to be considerate of how all of our students take in information and what barriers there may be to the way that we are presenting information that is resulting in them not understanding the task or misunderstanding, right? So if there's a problem with that filter, if things aren't coming in, well, the rest of the networks are all built off of that. Because then information goes through the affective network or the why. And so then information is processed and relayed for meaning in the center of the brain. And then finally, the information is organized in the frontal lobe for response or action, right? And when we talked about this previously, we talked about how younger individuals that make poor choices or have difficulty with impulse control, that's all having to do with that part of the brain. And we know the frontal lobe doesn't fully develop until around 25. But for individuals who are neurodiverse, they are going to continue to have difficulty or need supports for impulse control, for action, things like that. So as an overview, reminder of UDL networks, we have the recognition, strategic, and affective network. Those networks, that neuroscience is then the basis for the three principles, which is representation, action, expression, engagement. And then there are guidelines that align with each one of those. So when we're planning, we want to think about how learners are going to engage in the lesson. We then want to think about how the information is being presented. And then what do we want them to do? So how are learners are expected to act strategically and express themselves? Are we giving them strategies to use? So I have this image. Curious if anybody knows what this is and wants to put it into the chat. I'll give them a moment. Don't do like a Google image reverse search. So this is a topographical map of Mount Baker in Washington. Okay, so unless you are familiar with reading topographical maps, you may not be able to really interpret this. So in 1981, some researchers, Chi and colleagues, published a study examining how experts and novices, so this happened to be in physics, so an expert in physics versus a novice in physics, and just wanted to look at how do they approach solving problems. And what they found was that experts used and drew on their existing deep knowledge to solve the problem versus novices that use superficial features of the problem to arrive at an answer. And what that provides us with is evidence that what a person knows impacts what they see. And we've had similar experiments replicated over and over, and it's very helpful for us to understand the difference between an expert and a novice in anything, in setting up a printer, in baking, in writing with calligraphy. It can be in anything. It doesn't have to be, math word problem solving. So it also applies there. And so I need some background knowledge, some schema, in order to be able to interpret this map. So very similarly, we need to think about, if I'm focusing on map reading, how am I going to have them engage? How is information being presented? Is there likely additional information they're going to need? And how can we provide ways for them to show what they know? But simply providing something like an answer, a key, symbols, might not be enough. They are likely also going to need the key, right? Information, the key, and then they may need Some of your students may also need concepts explained, pictures explained, and that's not um, unique or specific to your neurodiverse students. This is going to be common for English language learners, for those who may have had limited life experiences, those who have been incarcerated and sort of missed some aspects of our history and culture. And so not only does it matter, what your experience is and what you know, but also the supports that you're given and explicit instruction in how to use and identify those supports. So, like, what is an avalanche? To even understand what an avalanche risk is. What's a ridge line? What is a ridge? Why does that matter? What is a peak? So, I first want to talk about how information is presented to learners. So there are three sort of questions that you can ask yourself as you're planning. Does the information that I'm providing help all learners comprehend and understand the symbols and expressions, and perceive what needs to be learned? So these are questions that you can ask yourself as you're planning to make sure that you are attending to these features. We also then can think about engagement, right? So does the lesson give options for all learners to regulate their learning? So to be able to persist, sustain effort and motivation and be engaged, because if we're not engaged, then no learning's happening. Engagement is this multidimensional construct. So it has cognitive aspects, so persistence and effort, an affective component of feeling of belonging and value, and then a behavioral component where the actual like observations of I see that you're engaged because you're nodding and giving me nonverbal feedback. And then finally, we want to think about how are we actively providing options, being explicit about what those options are, to help learners act strategically, express themselves, and physically respond. So particularly for our neurodiverse students, I'm going to kind of zero in on these aspects of UDL and the types of strategies we need to use and the type of skills we need to build. So I'm going to focus on engagement and then action expression. If we think about self-regulation, sustaining effort and persistence, and executive functions, those are three universal areas of need, three universal barriers. And that's what's so great about using the UDL framework is that it's not just like, oh yeah, this is going to be hard for you because you have a really hard time with goal setting or you have a really hard time breaking down tasks. It's saying, as the instructor, I'm going to acknowledge that this is something you need support in. And I am going to find ways to support you in developing these skills. So just like, as we were talking about what matters, right? Your experiences. Let's say you're going to go to a new place and curious if anyone's like me, but probably going to use Waze. I 100% rely on Waze at all times to get me where I need to go. Maybe you're going to use the navigation system in your car. Maybe you're pulling up some other mapping system. And the purpose of that is to help you to avoid making wrong turns and getting lost. And so you need to know what your destination is and then use some sort of a support to be able to choose the right strategy. You're kind of self-monitoring. Am I on the right way? Am I going the right way? This even happens when we get a ride share, right? So I was in San Diego recently and got into a Lyft, was headed to my hotel, and I pull up Waze and he's not going the direction that Waze says to go. And so that's my own even, self-monitoring the actions of others to make sure that I am being safe. So what some individuals are going to need is a roadmap, a very explicit saying, hey, you're going to a new place, or you're going someplace really far away. I go see my parents in Raleigh. A lot can happen on 95 North. None of it is good, especially when you're in the state of South Carolina. And so using Waze helps me know when, an obstacle's coming up, here's a way I can go around it. So we want adults, and we want learners and citizens to be strategic, to be able to self-regulate their behavior, to be strategic learners. But unfortunately, what often happens is without the explicit development of these strategies, they are not strategic. So this slide comes from an IRIS module on strategies. And so it has here the difference between a strategic learner and non-strategic learner. So strategic learners are going to be able to analyze a problem and develop a plan. I need to get here, and this is a way I could get there. They're able to organize multiple goals and flexibly switch between them, so they can, having multiple classes is okay, or having a big project in a class and then some smaller assignments along the way. They may, in a job setting, be able to, address different priorities and adjust what it is they're working on to take something, to do something that might be more urgent. They can develop new strategies. So they have adaptive skills. They can use self-regulated strategies, which are things like goal setting, self-monitoring, self-evaluation. They attribute high grades or pay increases, things like that, to their hard work, their internal locus of control, right? They realize that they are the ones who are responsible or who can impact things that happen in their life. Things do not always happen to them. And they can review those goals that they have set and self-monitor, determine, like, have I met that goal? Is that still a valuable goal for me? Should I, switch? Non-strategic learners, so it's not just that they can't analyze a problem and develop a plan. Specifically, they might be unaware of steps to take, how to break down something into a manageable task. And so simply saying, well, give yourself a timeline, or, chunk it out, that might not be sufficient if they don't know how. They may have problems with memory, lack persistence, have feelings of frustration and failure because they have failed and they have been frustrated. Those are valid feelings that they have, but they often are going to attribute those failures, those feelings of frustration, to things outside of their control. So they're more likely to have that external locus of control of it's, I don't have good luck, or that teacher doesn't like me, or my boss just doesn't like me, versus being able to, we could frame it in one way of taking responsibility for your actions, and being able to understand maybe why your boss was upset with you because of your actions. But that's also requiring theory of mind. So given what I just talked about when it comes to being strategic and self-regulated, let's take a look at these 9 skills. So choice making, decision making, problem solving, goal setting and attainment, self-regulation, self-advocacy, internal locus of control, self-advocacy, and self-awareness. These are 9 dimensions or skills of self-determination. So what is self-determination? When someone is self-determined, it means that they know what they want and how to get it. I love that very simple explanation. Carrie Sjogren then defines it as making things happen in your life. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're independent in everything, but rather that you have input. You are able to identify what you want to happen and what steps might need to take to get you there. So the self-determination framework, just like the UDL framework, is a connected set of concepts developed from theory. And so what Self-determination is based on this understanding of what does it take for humans to have psychological growth? What do we want to happen? You have to have autonomy. You need to be able to be in control of your behavior and your goals. You need to have competence, which is that ability to master new tasks and ability to learn new skills. And then you need connection, a sense of belonging and attachment to other people. How similar are those to that, the difference between a strategic and a non-strategic learner? A strategic learner is likely to be one that has autonomy, competence, and connection. So self-determined action can be broken down into a couple of different characteristics. So if you say someone is self-determined, they have autonomy and self-initiation. They have self-direction and pathways thinking. So they can break things down. They understand the way to get where they want to go. And then beliefs about their own control over what happens in their life. So having some accurate self-realization and self-awareness, control, expectancy, and psychological impairment. Empowerment, not impairment. And so there are things that we can do in order to help make sure that people know what they want, what are options out there for them, and how do they get there. So the strategy I want to talk through in our remaining time is called SRSD, or Self-Regulated Strategy Development. And this is coming from the IRIS module, which is a free online training that you can take for more information. There are 6 steps to self-regulated strategy development. First is develop background knowledge. Discuss it, model it, memorize it, support it, and encourage independent practice. So I'm going to walk through each of those. And all of this is based on this thought of what cannot be recalled cannot be used, right? So if you can't remember something, how are you going to use it, right? If I can't remember how to connect my printer, I'm not going to be able to do that. So the first step is background knowledge. So you want to ask things like, what skills do the students need? Do they have those skills? How can I teach them? I would say the 2 skills that we want to target and that can be embedded throughout whatever you're teaching is goal setting and self-monitoring. Next, we want to discuss it. So it's not just like, all right, you need to work on goal setting. So I want you to set a goal for what you're going to get on a quiz, or how many words per minute you're going to be able to read, or whatever it happens to be. We need to talk about it, help them see the benefit of the strategy, right? That's linking back to UDL and being able to make a connection to maintaining effort, persistence. Why is this relevant? Why should I care? Explain how it can be applied in different ways. So we're going to work on self-monitoring. This is something that we can work on, when we're developing our reading and being able to read more fluently. But it can also be, you can use it for maybe personal behavioral things you want to change, drinking more water, budgeting, getting places on time. And we want to show explicitly how students can measure their self-monitoring, because that's the critical next step, is that you're self-monitoring it and you're able to see, are you moving in the direction that you want to go? So here's an example from math where we provided students with, these were adult learners, they were all 21, in a transition program. And we were teaching them to solve multiplicative comparison word problems. So word problems were like, Jenny had 3 coffees, she had 4 times as many waters. So scaling something up. And so we broke the task down into the steps. We created this 2-column checklist so that students would check off whether they did this step by themselves or with help. And then we provided this graphic organizer to help make word problems can be very complex and abstract. And so this helped the students identify what it is they needed and all the complete parts of the equation. And then at the beginning of each instructional session, the teacher would say, well, what are you working on today? And what's your goal? Because if you can't state what it is you're even working on, you're not going to be able to self-monitor your progress towards it. And then at the end of each lesson, the teacher would ask, what did you work on? Again, can you tell me? What was your goal? What did you achieve? And we had them graph it. And what's your goal for tomorrow? This only adds a little bit of time on the front and back of each lesson, but it built up this skill. We then need to model it. So it also is not enough to say like, hey, this is a really great thing. You should have it. I think it's going to help you. Model and support how to use it. That is one of the most critical stages. We need to expose the learners to the thought process of, what do strategic learners think? What do they tell themselves? It's using think alouds to make it really explicit. Otherwise, they may think that we just know the answer, and they don't realize sort of the mental graphic organizer or decision making tree that we go through. So modeling with think alouds is one strategy, and then emphasizing self-talk, emphasizing positive self-talk. You may want to model like you having difficulty or being frustrated or wanting to quit, whether you kind of like rig a situation to make it look that way, or like there are genuine times when we each feel this way. And saying like, you know what, I'm feeling really frustrated. I cannot get this computer to connect to the projector. It's making me feel irritable and stressed because I worked really hard on this to prepare for you, and we're not going to get through it. And support positive self-talk. So you could say, something that you could say, I'm really working on positive self-talk. And I'm going to tell myself that everybody gets frustrated with technology and we can make up some of this next week. And then be honest and say, a negative thing for me to tell myself would be, you're just no good at technology. You should have gotten here earlier. You always leave things to the last minute. Those could be true. But repeating that is not helpful, okay? Because our brain believes the things that we hear and the things that we tell ourselves. We then want to memorize it, okay? So we want to make sure that students have memorized or understand all of those steps and whatever strategy it is that we're teaching them. They need to become fluent so they can use that strategy without having to like stop and think and use all of this working memory to think through what comes next. So we can do things like cue cards, over learning, which means anybody who has done like music or sports, you've engaged in over learning. It's you made a free throw, do 10 more. And then we can also give like little songs or physical movements to help them remember. And remembering, being able to memorize it and use it over time, that's maintenance. What we need to do in self-regulated strategy development is model and support so that they can acquire the skill. They can then become fluent in the skill, which means that it doesn't take as much cognitive energy. We want them to maintain it over the time and then generalize it, which means be able to apply it in different areas. Step 5 is support it. So we can support these skills through scaffolding. It can come in different forms. What each year student may need, even for the same task, may be different. And the same student may need different supports depending on the task, right? So there's not one universal like scaffolding. It depends on the buildings, depends on what you're going to do. Are you just cleaning out gutters or are you painting the whole thing? Right? So it depends. There are 2 components to scaffolding: modeling and practice. So, and then there are different 3 types. So you can scaffold the content, meaning maybe you're going to make sure that the content isn't too difficult or unfamiliar to practice a new skill. So if we are practicing or learning, a writing strategy, how to use evidence to support a claim, maybe we're not going to do that on like a brand new topic that they have no idea about. Maybe instead we're going to use students' preferences and interests in order to practice that new skill. The task can be scaffolded by modeling it, doing it together and then gradually giving them more responsibility to do it. Or the material can be scaffolded. We might add more prompts or more cues. We may have that task analysis, for the word problem and the equation template, and then we might take that away over time. Again, you want to model it. So it's not just practicing and providing the scaffolds, but that you're showing like, I'm stuck. Here are things I can do. model frustration, model appropriate ways to seek assistance. And then step 5 is support it. So we want to go through all the phases of learning. We want to get all the way to maintenance and generalization. And so that means that we can collaboratively use these strategies and self-regulation with students. So we want to be continually modeling it, continually providing opportunities for it to be developed. And then fade that support based on the phase of learning. So if the students are demonstrating like they are maintaining this over time, they're able to use it in other contexts, well, maybe I don't need to provide like cues or prompts anymore. And then finally, we want to encourage independent practice. So independent practice is going to be where I'm not, modeling it or doing it with you. I want you to set your own goal. I want you to use a strategy independently. And then we want to monitor that and maybe provide some supports. One example of a common self-regulated strategy is SQ3R. So SQ3R is a great self-regulated strategy, meaning you, the individual, is in charge of implementing it and doing it. And it can be used for any reading comprehension task. And the steps are to survey or skim, meaning kind of skim, look at the passage, ask yourself questions. So sort of like going ahead and thinking about what might be what that might be about. One great strategy for doing that is turning headers into questions. So if the headings are like habitat of pandas, diet of pandas, health issues of pandas, have them turn those into questions. So like, what is the habitat of a panda? What are the health issues, right? So you're teaching them to take headings and create questions, because then it's priming your brain for what to attend to. Because our neurodiverse students, we need to make it really explicit what it is you need to pay attention to in this to comprehend the story. So I'm going to wrap up because I think we are at the end of our time. I do have a lot of resources for you all that I'll include in the PowerPoint that we send out. But I wanted to highlight a few. One are these are 2 resources to learn more specifically about learners with autism. They're both free. They're super high quality. You can get professional learning credits from them. So one is Ocali has the AIM Autism Internet modules. And then the Frank Porter Graham Center out of UNC Chapel Hill has Affirm Autism-Focused Intervention Research and Modules. So if this is something that you feel like you want more support in, this is a really great resource. Another source you can trust, which I mentioned, was the IRIS Center. IRIS Center is free. They continually update their resources, and they have information related to all kinds of things of instruction and supporting students with disabilities, right? And finally, professional organizations are a great source of support and information. Obviously, ACE of Florida is a primary one to be sure that you're engaged with, because these are your peers who are facing similar tasks as you. But I also want to point you to 3 other professional organizations. So one is the Council for Exceptional Children. That is the professional organization in special education. And they have interest groups or divisions. So one is the Division on Autism and Developmental Disabilities. They have a great YouTube page. They have a website. And it is all specifically related to autism and intellectual or developmental disabilities. Then the DCDT, Division for Career Development and Transition, is specifically focused on helping individuals with disabilities transition to meaningful, fulfilling adult lives. So there you'll find things related to job, employment, independent living, post-secondary education, anything related to that. There's then AAIDD, which is a great resource for really more medical information. And then CHAD, Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. They have really great and accessible, understandable resources um, uh, to kind of understand how ADHD can impact individuals. All right. Thanks so much for joining me. And I hope I see you in March at our last webinar.